You're listening to Taste for Truth Weight Loss Encouragement. I'm your host, Barb Raveling. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I hope you are enjoying this Christmas season. I hope you're visiting with family and friends and leaning into God if you're feeling a little bit lonely this season or if you're missing someone that you love. And I also hope that you're leaning into God just to eat with control this season, because we all know how hard that is with all the little treats around. I'm excited about today's interview. I mentioned on last month's podcast. This is our second interview with Stacey, who has kept her 150 pounds off for 6 years now. So this is going to be such a helpful podcast episode. It'll be helpful for those of you guys who have a lot of weight to lose. It'll be helpful for those who haven't lost your weight yet, no matter how much you have to lose, and also those who are approaching maintenance or in the middle of maintenance. I just think she has a lot of wisdom. She has spent a lot of time renewing her mind, and because of that, she just has so much insight. So I'm excited to share this with you. Now, she does talk a little bit about trauma in this podcast, recovering from trauma and emotional eating. And she did get some counseling for that. If you guys have had a trauma in your life and you haven't really worked through it yet, it can be helpful to work through that with a counselor. So maybe you have somebody at your church, or your church has a program, but it feels a little uncomfortable to do. I would encourage you to, maybe just take the first step or truth journal about it. Because sometimes this is something that God can use to help you. And if you need help with online counseling, you can go to getfaithful.com/Christian habits. That's getfaithful.com/Christian habits and get some counseling there, or try and find a local counselor, because I think it's always nice if you can see a counselor face to face. But I wanted to give you that other link if you'd rather do something online. Okay, let's get to today's interview. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. It's so great to have everyone here today. And I am really excited to have a guest today that we had on the podcast almost 6 years ago, back on October 10th, 2018. So if you guys want to listen to that interview, that'd be helpful to listen to that one before this interview. And this is Stacey. So welcome back to the podcast again, Stacey.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, why don't you tell us just a little bit about what your life is now? Because I suppose in 6 years, it might have changed a bit.
Yeah, well, we just got out for school, but I'm still doing pediatric therapy in a local school district. I'm still involved in ministry, a lot of with food issues, some addiction issues. I work with kids ministry on and off, doing some different things there. Life has changed a lot the last 6 years, some of it good, some of it, not so good, but it's been interesting to see what God's done.
Okay. Well, that's exciting. And, before we started recording this interview, Stacey and I talked a bit, and I'm interested to talk a little bit more about, different ways she's been renewing, what God's been doing in her life. But on the last interview, we were talking about weight loss. Stacey had just lost 150 pounds. So let's just begin with weight loss. I'm sure everybody's wondering, did you keep it off all those years? That's almost 6 years, 150-pound weight loss.
Well, I'll share this statistic. When I was first starting my food journey, they gave me a statistic that I would only be successful out 10 years up to 1%. And
wow.
So those aren't really
1%.
Great.
Wow.
I will say I'm still in the same clothing size. I still have kept that weight off. So I would say, yes, I've been very successful with the tools that I learned both from you and just the disciplines I learned, 6 years ago. It's been good.
That's amazing. And I remember 6 years ago, you had given up sugar. So you had done Taste for Truth Bible study. You were renewing your mind 2 to 3 times a day. And you were on pretty strict guidelines as far as no sugar and then, certain portions of food. So I'd be curious to know, do you still have to renew to keep it off? Are you still off sugar? Are you still in the same boundaries?
I don't have sugar. I'm still sugar-free. Then I was very careful and still am very careful with flour products. I don't, on my daily life, I'm still, I eat a very clean, just vegetables, meat, fruit. But I think one thing that has changed with my boundaries is I'm able to travel better. I don't, I do my best to do the same thing when I'm out eating, but I used to be very strict. And so I think over time, God's given me more peace about I'm able to make choices that are in moderation, and I've prayed about that. I think the other thing that's probably changed over the last 6 years is I still eat my meals or 2 meals a day. I do an intermittent fasting type, more for convenience for me. But I still try not to snack in between meals. But I don't weigh to exact proportions like I used to. So even back then, it was okay to eyeball things. But yeah, so that's what's changed. I still have boundaries in place, the no sugar, very, very limited flour. But the rest of it, I've just, I use moderation, and I feel like I've learned to do that.
Okay. And that's interesting because I feel like when people do gain their weight back, a lot of times the reason they gain it back is they let go of the boundaries altogether. And even though you have relaxers a little bit, you do still have boundaries and you're still following them. Now, I do remember you talked about how hard it was to go off sugar, that you craved it for 6 months. Do you crave it at all anymore in the last 6 years? Do you ever crave it?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I'll say this, eating out was a struggle. And a lot of it's because it's so social. Eating out is a social thing. And so I still, that's one thing that I kind of had to work on, and just mention that I have to let those go. But there's been times when they'll bring me a sweetened tea and I'll get a drink of it. Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible. And all my friends laugh because they're like in my face, and which I know if you're not from the South, but in the South, that's all they drink. And so, yeah, that's not, honestly, I'm completely free from cravings, which, man, I hadn't even thought about that in a long time, but it is a blessing not to crave like I used to.
Wow, that's incredible. And that will encourage anybody who's listening, I think, who is actually trying to go off sugar. And it's like, are the cravings ever going to go away? Because you did crave for 6 months, but you stuck with it.
Yeah.
And now you have been craving the last 6 years. So that's a pretty big blessing. I also remember in the last interview, you said that one thing was hard, and maybe you alluded to it already, was when you went to social gatherings, you feel left out because everybody else was eating sugar. Do you feel left out anymore?
I've recently had some life changes where new people are in my life. And so when people meet me and they realize I don't eat sugar, because everybody offers it, like, hey, would you like this dessert? And you have to be like, okay, how am I going to address that? So it's a little bit more, it's been more awkward the last 6 months just because of life changes. But before that, my friends just knew, like, that's just how that they don't even think about it. So I think it's more prevalent now in my mind just because I've had to explain to people my journey. It's been nice, though, because it's opened up new people to talk about it with. But you have to explain that whole social thing. And at least here, sugar is like that social lubricant where it makes conversation easier because you're talking about the food on the table. And, I feel like back then and even now, my social, and I really connect with people on a deeper level. And so that's the one thing I love about it. But they all want to know about my food. So yeah, it's still awkward, but it's just because I've had a life change the last 6 months.
That's interesting, but awkward, but worth it.
Oh yeah. Because it really gives me that, I think my life is a witness of what God can do. And when they hear my story, because it's after 7 years, people that they really forget that part of my story. Like I have even people that knew me then, like when I showed them side by side pictures, are like, I forgot that was your life. And so, my whole life has changed. And so when people meet me now, they have no idea. They feel like I've been this size all of my life, which opens up some other things to consider. But anyway, it's just, it's great opportunity for me to share what God's done. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. And even though I didn't have 150 pounds to lose, it was the same thing where at the beginning, everybody's like, oh, you changed. And then after that, nobody thinks about it anymore after a while. And then new people I meet, they just don't even know that you used to struggle with it. And I'm sure people looking at you would be shocked that you used to weigh 150 pounds more.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. And we do have before and after pictures. We had that in your first post. So I could include those in this post as well. So if you guys want to see that, you could do that. But how about, do you still need to renew your mind then? So are the boundaries so easy to follow that you don't need to renew for food for food anymore? So I'm not talking about other things, but do you need to renew for food or anything else, I guess? Do you need to renew to keep from emotional eating or breaking your boundaries?
I will tell you, there's times, if there's new emotional issues, stressful issues, sometimes I still have to renew about being bored. I mentioned that one of my boundaries is 2 meals and no snacking. I have found that at times I'm like, oh, I wish, and it's not sugar, but it's just something to keep me busy, and so I there are times I'm like, okay, why are you wanting to go and snack right now? Are you hungry? Are you bored? And most of the time for me, it's boredom. So I think I still, it's not like it used to be where I had to get the paper out, write everything down and try to figure it out. It's more like, oh, you're bored right now. Let's go do something different. But that's still to me renewing my mind in the moment.
Oh, yeah, it's interesting. So you're not like going through the donut questions or even truth telling. You're just kind of in your mind giving a little check and saying,
Yeah.
are you? That's good. The interesting thing for me too, I suppose, probably the thing that makes me want to break my boundaries most is procrastination for not wanting to do something work-wise. And I just made a boundary that I can't have lunch until 11:30 or 12, unless I'm going out for lunch with somebody or there's some really good reason not to. And I found that really keeps me from emotional eating for procrastination because I can't eat even though I'm not breaking my boundaries technically, but I am having lunch at 10 and I'd rather not have lunch at 10. That makes me procrastinate my work. So it's interesting how once you reach this stage where you've been free for so long, you can kind of do things with self-control. You don't have to go to all the work at the beginning.
Oh yeah. Right.
When you think of all the renewing you did, back, 6-7 years ago, to break free and to lose the 150 pounds. Do you have any idea how many hours you spent renewing about it?
Oh my goodness. I would think thousands. I would think
Wow.
Yeah. And no lie, like early on, I think it was hours of going through the questions. I always had my questions right there. But over the course of the years, I mean, yeah, it's taken a long time for me to rework that pattern, that way of thinking, but it has absolutely worked. I'm free from that. But yeah.
Yeah. And I guess for me, it was hundreds. And if you're listening to it before you do those hundreds of hours or thousands, you're like, oh, that's crazy. I can't do that. But how many minutes or hours a day was it when you were breaking free?
So I probably renewed before every meal 5 or 10 minutes, so that's your 30 minutes. And then at night, when I was doing a lot of my preparation for the next day, I had to go through grieving the food. And so that's why I say for me, that first year, an hour a day, not continually. I mean, you're talking, and I talked about, there's something I learned called habit stacking. It might have been when I was heating up food or traveling from work to home when I wanted to take that detour and take a snack. It wasn't constant because I was a mom. I'm still a mom of 2 kids. My kids are older. But I mean, really, when I think about the work, it was just minutes upon minutes stacked together. And then I think why, I say thousands is it's been 7 years, of different times, doing that.
So you're saying you spent thousands of hours renewing. It wasn't thousands of hours to break free, because if you were already broken free so you're probably could be more the hundreds too. Yeah. So both of us, and when you think some people spend an hour getting ready every day with hair, makeup, and clothes. A lot of people spend an hour exercising or walking, or how many of us can spend an hour just wasting time on the internet? It's not that much time in the grand scheme of things. And then when you think of what you have to show for it,
and I'll say, I'm sorry. I was going to say this. Back then, I would spend an hour planning that next meal. looking at the recipes or thinking about where I'm going to go eat or what. I mean, it was a lot of mental energy, honestly, back in the day, thinking about food for me, because I used it for everything. So, I mean, and I think there's people out there that they may relate to that. They don't realize that they're putting mental energy into preparing that next meal or the next dessert, or and then when I stopped thinking about it, man, there was so much free space in my mind that I didn't know what to do with. And that's the truth. That was the truth.
Well, plus it takes time to hop in the car and go to the Dairy Queen.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? To drive to the
Yeah.
Dairy Queen, eat the Blizzard, come home, and then go search all over the house for the hidden treats. All of that takes time. Okay, so it sounds to me, so you kept it off, you kept your boundaries, and you did hundreds of hours renewing beforehand to change your thinking. In my mind, that's why you've kept it off all these years. But I should have asked you first, in your mind, what has kept it off all these years?
I think the work I did on the front end, and I have people that have walked with me, and I will share one of the life events that changed as I went through a pretty long divorce. And that was year 3. And my friends during the time said, Stacey, if you had not put the work in early on to renew your mind and to set your habits, those are what carried me through that emotional time. And I think that's what a lot of people are, at least at that point, it was a real struggle to stay with my boundaries, but I had 3 years of learning that. So definitely I'm grateful I put the work in at the front end. I've had deaths in my family, all the things that come. But that's why I'm grateful I did it early on.
Oh, yeah. That's really interesting, because I think a lot of us, once we lose our weight, hard things happen in life. And for a lot of people, those hard things will send them back to eating again, because you want to comfort yourself with sugar. I mean, I would imagine people go through divorce, it'd be pretty common to gain weight because it's so painful. But if you renew your mind instead, and that's what you need to do, first of all, to keep the weight off. But I think that's also what you need to do to grow in the ways God wants you to grow from a trial that you may or may not have initiated. A lot of times trials happen to us. There's nothing we can do about it. But our only choice is either to go through it relying on God and learning what he wants to learn, renewing our mind, or to go through it and get bitter and resentful and, just very discontent and unhappy.
Right. So
how in the last 5 or 6 years, what's been your renewing habits since, or any ways God has changed you in other ways through renewing besides, the eating he did 6 years ago?
Well, and I shared this a little bit before, my food journey continued on, like I said, year 3, and that hits. That's probably about the time I really started digging into the emotional aspects of why I ate. And I knew I've lived life, but there was a lot of trauma in the background of everything. And to be quite honest, I ate to cover up all feelings. So, how did I use what I learned the first 3 years is then I began applying those same tools to my emotional growth and journey. What was I feeling? What was the truth? Even identify what emotions I was feeling in the moment, whether it was sadness or joy. I used food to cover all things, I didn't want to feel. And so coming through that, I think that's how God's continued working through those emotional things and using, honestly, truth journaling to get to the bottom of my identity in Christ, number one, because I had a lot of negative thoughts, not a lot of negative self-talk. And so what I learned with my food to write out that truth, write out whatever I was thinking in that moment, he then shifted it to what I was thinking about myself, my body, my situation, how I was feeling in the moment. So to me, everything I learned about my food kept going into other areas of my life to set me free. And I'm That part, honestly, I tell people all the time, 150 pounds is a miracle. It is. It's God giving me the strength to make the right choices and to understand my body and my thinking. But what really is the transformative part is what he did in my mind through, Romans 12 to renewing my mind in every aspect of who I am. And I say this all the time, if I had to, and I don't want that, I'm not saying that, but between the two journeys, my mind being free or being free of the weight, I would pick my mind every day, from fear and anxiety and depression and all the things that were happening in my life. Thank God he's given me both, right? He's given me the tools, but it did start with my food. And then he just kept working through other areas of my life. And I didn't expect that. That was not what I started to do on this journey, but I'm so grateful for it.
Yeah. And I would agree with you because I've been freed in both areas too, but I started with the mind first. So I was freed with the mind before I was freed with the food. And of course, we're not 100% free because that doesn't mean we don't, have days where we wake up and we're worried or whatever. But it's just that are you describing, because when I think of being free from the mind, I felt like there was a big time in my life, many years, where I was just either depressed or stressed or annoyed or overthinking like all the time, like 95% of the time. And I feel that's what God really freed me up to live in peace and joy. And it was only after that I thought, okay, well, maybe I can tackle food. And if I hadn't been freed in those other areas first and seen God do it, that it could be done, I don't know if I would have believed he could do it for food. So I'd love to hear how your journey was the opposite.
Well, I think for me, I've thought about that. I really do think I use food to numb. I mean, just straight numb, just like a person with alcohol or drugs. My food was a numbing agent. And so for me, I think he had to tackle the food first because I was not going to allow the rest of that to be touched. Honestly, I didn't know how to deal with all the stuff that was inside of me, the things I'd been through, the trauma. I didn't have the tools to deal with that. So I used food. And I don't know if that's why it was that way, but I find it interesting that he can work through different ways with different people, but we get to the same freedom. Thank you, Lord. Right. But I do know that if I had not let go of my food, I think I would have continued to medicate myself and just not dealt with the rest of that stuff. I didn't, honestly, I didn't want to deal with it. And the only reason why I did deal with it is because I didn't use the food anymore to cope. And it was just coming out, and so I had to do something with it. And so I gave it to God, but it was working through all those mind renewal techniques that I've learned. Same process for me. And I will share this. I struggled from pretty severe PTSD. I got to the point where I almost didn't want to leave my house. This was after the weight loss. There was so much, and honestly, and I'm just going to say this because somebody probably will deal with this. When I'd use my weight a lot to be invisible.
Interesting.
People probably don't understand that, but when you're 300 plus pounds, people don't mess with you. They don't hit on you. They don't say compliments to you. And I call it a hid in plain sight. Well, when you lose the weight, you get recognized, number one, for losing the weight. And that in itself was very uncomfortable for me. But then I had to deal with all the attention elsewhere. It was hard, to be honest with you. And that's why I had to kind of work through some of that. But I've been set free from that as well. So I work with women a lot on those issues, which I don't think we talk about as much.
That's interesting because I've had people ask me about that because I've had some people get close to their goal weight and then they are worried about all that and they're worried about being attractive to men. And then they feel like they sabotage themselves and kind of, I don't know if it's intentionally gain the weight back or it just happens because they're worried about it. So how did you prevent that from happening since you felt it?
Well, I felt it. I went through it, if that makes sense. Like I allowed myself to feel that fear. So I would journal about that. I'm feeling vulnerable. I'm feeling afraid. I don't like when people acknowledge me. I don't like it when they pay attention. And then I would put I would put truth on that. I mean, those feelings were true, but some of the fear that was coming from that was based on previous past trauma. I had to deal with that. So that's where honestly the journaling came in, where I could acknowledge, hey, some of this that you're feeling is not from the weight loss, it's from other stuff that you need to deal with. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I was able to separate it out, because I do think we self-sabotage. And if you don't realize that, there may be a woman watching this and don't realize at the end of that journey, I'm self-sabotaging because really I don't want people to pay attention to me. The real issue is not that you're trying to sabotage yourself. It's why is that happening? And that was a whole nother journey God took me down, and got me, and I'm free from that, if that makes sense. So
yes. Do you remember any of the truths you wrote down that helped you with that?
I did a lot of scriptures about safety, and in the real time, I had friends that in social settings, they would know to get around me, and they would help me with some of those, like people approaching me. They helped give me a safety net, but I had to get honest with, this was the hard part. I had to get honest with the people closest to me. They had no idea what I had been through. And I'm not talking about graphic, but just to say, hey, I've been through some hard things in my life. And when people are approaching me now that I'm this small, it's really unsettling me. And that's about what I would say to them. And I would say, hey, if you see me being uncomfortable, can you come and we'll go, they would learn how to divert me away from certain situations. And, I mentioned I was in ministry and that in being in social situations, but my friends really kind of supported me. And as I learned how to do that for myself and how to guide certain conversations, unwanted attention, how to do that in a nice way without either, number one, getting really upset or trying to push people away. Those are those things. So I just would renew my mind. So I renewed my mind to what I was thinking. And then I got honest with some really close friends of mine, and they helped walk me through that. So it was honestly, God he took care of me. Now that I'm thinking about it, man, he really surrounded me. But getting real and honest about my true feelings through truth journaling, it really helped me even know how to talk to my friends about things. So
yeah, that's interesting, because I think with emotions, we can stuff them and deny them, or we can explode, yell at people, or just always be crying or whatever, or we can eat them away. And when you eat them away, it's like, hey, everything's fun, exciting. Because I've heard other people talk about how what shocked them is that they began to feel their emotions more intensely after they stopped eating.
Yeah.
You felt that way too.
Yes. I didn't, it was so intense. I didn't know what to do with them.
Yeah. So did you, did you just start truth journaling, or did you also do some counseling, that sort of thing?
I do have a friend that's a counselor, and she would do some private conversations with me, and work through a lot of that, especially the heavy trauma parts. But mainly it was just godly friends. Some of them have been through similar things, so they were able to help guide me through that. So it was a little bit of all of it, but mostly truth journaling and godly counsel, pastors and other friends that kind of helped get me through some of that.
Yeah, that's good. Because I think a lot of times when things happen in our past, we just assume the same things are going to happen in our present. But we have to think, okay, back in the past, it was totally different circumstances. I'm a different person now. And it's not a big chance it's going to happen the same way. I don't know. Did you have to deal with anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. And still to this day, new things are coming up, new situations. Like I said, 6 months ago, I changed. I mean, this is just the God's growth in my life, but I had those friends and I had kind of made a safe bubble to learn to, play in and work in. And, I was learning to do it in the safety of my closest friends. And then I changed churches, changed ministries, and I went out on my own, and I realized I was a lot stronger than I thought I was, but it's a whole new challenge to do that with total strangers in a new place without that safety net. And that's really when I realized how much God had done in my life. that I was able to go and function. But at first it was hard because I went back to thinking some of those things and I'm like, no, I'm beyond that. So yeah, absolutely. You still have to keep reminding yourself that the past is the past, and I'm not that person. So I don't know. It's just been an awesome journey, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Well, an interesting thing too is when you went to this new environment. I mean, a lot of times when God starts us on a growth process, and I think He starts us when we take the first step and say, "Hey, we want to grow. We're willing to sacrifice to grow." And that might be really willing to renew our mind a bunch of times, the hundreds of hours. When we go out of our comfort zone, like you did with this new ministry, that's another opportunity for growth because you have new challenges. And so it's neat to see how God brings us along, gives us new opportunity of growth, or uses the things that are already happening that He might not have caused, but they're happened, and use those for growth too.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. And I've been reading Proverbs too lately and talking about, searching for wisdom and all the blessings we get when we search for wisdom. And I think when we renew our mind, we are seeking wisdom because God matures us. He pours out truth. He helps make us wise, and we become more mature and just reap all the benefits that maturity brings.
Yes.
Now, did you ever go back and truth journal any of the past events? Because I've done that before and I found that powerful. Did you ever give that a try?
In a roundabout way, yes. Probably didn't call it that. Yeah, I didn't call it that, but now that you say that, in the process, I use the same tools to go back and look at some of that stuff and accept truth and what some of it had been colored by the events. Does that make sense? So yeah.
Yeah. So how did that change things? Did that help at all?
Yeah, I think I saw it from a different perspective. I mean, most everything I think when, you ask God to show you too, when you're doing that, He shows you a different perspective of things. It doesn't mean that what I experienced was my experience, but I have definitely seen it from a different perspective. And I'm grateful for that because it's allowed me to be free from that past, reliving all the things, and yeah, it's very powerful. Yes.
Well, I think it's so interesting because I had just listened to your interview a little bit ago in preparation for this one. And at the time, I was struck that you had talked a lot about Taste for Truth and how that book helped you so much, and you truth journaled. And I thought, I wonder why you didn't ever talk about freedom from emotional eating. I didn't even know if you did it. But then to hear that you approached only the food first and then started really dealing with emotions afterwards, it kind of makes more sense. So I'm curious to know, did you do the freedom from emotional eating Bible study too? Or did you just kind of truth journal with God and figure all that out with God?
No, I did the emotional eating one, that probably it was probably after we got done talking, because that was about the time I was really starting to get into that part of my journey. Did it several times through. I've probably done Taste for Truth 8 to 10 times.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I'm a slow learner.
Well, I wrote it and I've probably done it 3 times, and they weren't all for food either. Some of them were for, others. I think I did a lot for my writing and procrastination, because you can also do that one for habits. Now, one thing I noticed is when my first renewing project, that was an annoyance one, and I chose that. And I think I chose the eating one too, but I think a lot of times I feel like God's the one choosing the project. And He's not like coming out and saying, Barb, in an audible voice, I want you to do this. It's just that He's bringing all these trials into my life that kind of have a theme. And I feel like He's kind of saying, hey, Barb, look at your area you need to work on. Have you found that to be true in the past 6 years?
Yeah, there's different, for sure. There's different things I'm working on. Currently, I'm working on contentment. So same thing, honestly. I'm telling you, your work really, just the whole Romans 12:2, it just opened that whole thing up for me. But yeah, I mean, I just was journaling the other day. Why am I feeling discontented? So the same thing. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've actually been working on contentment too the last couple of years, and I'm really excited because I'm going to start doing these online courses. And I was going to start with a discontentment class, but I had a survey and there were some other votes. So I wanted to do a renewing the mind class first, and that was the biggest vote, but that wasn't the second biggest. So anyway, I just love I love learning. I love growing in these different areas. And she's nodding, Stacey's nodding in your head. So I'm guessing you love growing as well.
I do. I think when you have success in one area, it motivates you to try different things and freedom. I think that's one thing that, when I got free in one area, I really was like, okay, God, what else will you set me free in? And I've just kept, it's kind of like you said, whatever he brings up, and whatever seems to keep coming in my life, I'm like, all right, I want to live the way that you want me to live, which is what we're both talking about. And so absolutely, like, I love the podcast but really just that freedom. And it's really hard to convey that in these moments, but like, it is worth the work. I mean, people may hear hundreds of hours, but like, I'm here to say it is so worth the investment in ourselves. Learning to love ourselves enough to invest like that as women, but then we're better for everybody around us, and I know as a mom, that was hard for me to get my mind around because I'm just going from ball practice but it's like, I really did learn that when I'm who he says I am and I invest in that growth and I invest in who he, being what he's called me to be, I live in so much freedom. The people around me are like, you're totally different. I will say this is terrible. But they were like, before your weight loss, you were like a thundercloud that just walked around. And that's terrible to hear. And they're like, but your whole personality shifted and you are full of light and love. And it's true. I was so miserable, and it was just my mindset. So yes, I love growing. I love to grow.
Yeah. I had a few people say similar things to me. One friend said, well, back before you really started truth sharing, you were kind of intimidating.
Yeah.
So that probably meant something far worse, and she used the kind word to describe it. But yeah, we can feel the weight. You feel like you're walking in the fruit of the spirit more, feeling more peace and joy and just freed up. So it's, in a way, it's kind of like salvation. Salvation's, happens in a moment. The difference with renewing the mind, it doesn't happen in a moment. It's a journey, but it seems like the initial thing that you break free from, it breaks a little bit in your mind to give you some freedom, some ongoing lasting freedom. And then you still have other areas to work through. I don't know if I can describe it that well, but that was the experience for me.
Yeah. Same for me. And I'm so grateful. Very grateful.
Yeah, me too. Well, do you have any, well, let me ask first too, how often do you renew now, or what does that look like? I'm sure it's not the same every day or anything, but just what does your renewing journey look like right now, or your renewing discipline?
I probably do it 2 or 3 times a week where I, especially now that I'm out for the summer, I love to sit down and I do a lot of growth in the summer. But when I'm busy, it might be, it's kind of like I described earlier. It's just the thought that I'll kind of grab and think, okay, why did you think that? So it may not be writing. It may not, although I do prefer writing, slows my brain down to where I can really get in there. And sometimes I write it, and when I go back and read it, I'm like, wow, that's what I was really thinking. But renewing the mind is just in the moment. I've learned and trained myself to think, okay, now why did you think that? And really questioning rather than accepting those thoughts as truth. So it's probably more like that these days.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. So you can do it more in your mind now.
Yeah.
I think I'm only just now starting to develop that ability. But I hadn't really tried it much before. And I am starting to truth journal. I hadn't been for very much for a while. And that now I started up again, probably have been for a couple months, but I'm working on a project now. I'm working on overcoming perfectionism. I have perfectionism in a couple of areas of my life. So I've never really worked on that one or studied it. And it's pretty fascinating. I want to do a class on that one too. There's so many classes I want to make. It's like, and I need to get on the ball, figure out how to do them and start making them. So what would you say to the person who's listening, who's like, oh dear, I wish my transformation was 6 years ago. So they're listening and they're still where you were back in like about 2016 when you were feeling like pretty much ready to give up. I think you gave one last stab at it, you said, and you're ready to give up. So what kind of advice would you give to that person now, like about 8 years later for you?
One thing it is, take it one day at a time, and for me to think 6 years out was impossible. That's why I had to really break it down to small increments. I mean, I think I may have said this my first time. I thought, okay, I'll just do this for 50 days. And I didn't think I'd make it 50 days, to be honest with you. I was like, I can't do that. But just, it's sometimes we want to get ahead of the process. And I'm that way. I do not like to wait. I do not like the process. I do not like the discipline. And so I understand that. But I would also say early in that, I would watch people that were 6 years out and think, if they can do it, I can do it too. And listen to them say, take it one day at a time. And if you have a bad moment, if your boundaries were not sharp as they need to be that day, I really did learn the lesson of like, go to the very next day, because I used to beat myself up a lot because I failed. I'd start at the beginning of the day and fail by 5 o'clock. And so that's what I would say is like, it's worth the journey. It's worth the effort. You're worth the effort. And I know it's overwhelming right now to think, where can I be in 6 years? Or even I've got to lose 150 pounds. I mean, that number in itself was staggering to me. And I thought, I'll never be, that's what I said, I'll never be able to do this. And I really stopped saying I'll never and just said, okay, today I'm going to do what I can do. And I really did shift my mindset to that. And so I think that's what I would encourage them with is, just do what you can do today. And then tomorrow do the same thing. And after day after day, you're 6 years down the road and you're totally free from so many things. It's worth the journey.
Yeah. And I would say too, if you can try and renew as soon as possible, so you don't go into self-condemnation land. Because as soon as you go there, then you start feeling hopeless, you never change. And that's when the binges take place. So a lot of people who start Truth Journaling, they tell me the first thing that left was the binging. That was the first thing they go. And at least if you get rid of that, at least then you're not gaining the weight, or it's a huge thing to get rid of. And how about, do you have any different advice? And maybe it's not going to be different for the person who's listening to this and they did renew their mind and they did lose the weight, but they weren't part of the 1%. They were part of the 99% that regain either some or all their weight. A lot of times people will gain back. The most common thing I hear back is people will gain back maybe 20 to 30% of their weight and they'll keep it off, which to me is still a victory.
Yeah.
But what would you say to that person if it's any different?
I don't really know. I think that it's easy to get, because I have talked to people that have done that, and it's easy for them to get discouraged, and I think and they've gotten back down, or they've lost their weight again, but it's that constant up and down. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
I think it is a hard one because I think, at the beginning, you're all excited about truth journaling and renewing. You're in the honeymoon phase. You have all that discipline. And then second time it's around like, oh, I don't know if I can work up the oomph again. Although that is what you need to do, because that's why I stopped worrying about gaining my weight back, because I knew if I ever start gaining weight back, I'll just do what I did to lose it this time. I'll just go back to renewing all the time. So I think that my advice would be make a commitment to renew 3 times a day. Find an accountability partner to help you do it. And I would say renew just as much about how you feel about yourself as about the weight. Renew just as much about beating yourself up and, oh, I'm so terrible, because that's almost in some ways you might have to get rid of that before you have the stamina to follow boundaries. And maybe also ask, if you've only gained 20%, is it that bad? Do you really have to lose it? I mean, sometimes the answer would be, yes, I need it for health, or I need it for my family or whatever. But sometimes the answer will be, no, I'm good enough.
Right. So, and I think that's part of that freedom. I think that's why I struggle with that question, is because sometimes it may be that you needed to gain a little more back. You might have, I I've talked to ladies that are, losing weight can be just as rewarding as eating sugar. So there's just, that question's hard to answer. But I will say, I think one thing that has helped me in that area is really listening to you, especially when I got around maintenance, and then with what I was doing to other friends. And I knew that I couldn't really let go of the renewing of my mind. I will be honest with you. And it's just, I knew before I got there, and I trained myself and I prepared for that. I kind of had a prepared plan for maintenance, if you will. And that was always a part of it. So I constantly do that. So yeah, I think going back to those habits that work for you, that is exactly what we have to do. And I think that's one thing, if I could encourage somebody, just realize that our habits are our habits for a reason. Our boundaries may, you may not need them to be as strict. I can allow my boundaries to flex a little bit, but my habits really have stayed pretty consistent. And that's probably what's helped me to stay consistent in my journey. That makes sense.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up the maintenance, because I think that's another key, is you have to really consider maintenance as another project. So once you reach the weight that you want to be at, you have to be like, okay, I'm not through yet, because maintenance is going to be it's going to be round 2. And in some ways, it's just as hard or harder than losing the weight.
I think it's harder because for me, with the program I was on, you started adding foods back. And I think a lot of people will think I can add whatever, and you have more freedom. You've kind of earned the right to have a little more freedom, but with freedom comes responsibility. So to me, it's harder. It's harder.
Yeah. So you have to think about keeping renewing for a certain number, maybe few months after you hit maintenance, and make sure you have boundaries. You still have to have primary boundaries. So for me, I lost with Weight Watchers. I went to 3 meals and 1 snack. And that was different than Weight Watchers. So in a way, it's like I had to learn a different boundary system, because I had different lies that made me want to eat. Because then I could say things like, oh, well, if I thought about it before lunch, I would have decided to have this. It's like different lies if you have a different boundary system. So yeah. And it sounded like you did that. You were prepared for maintenance. You knew it'd be difficult, and you renewed and all that too.
Right.
Okay, good. Okay, well, that's been so helpful. Thank you. It's just really been great hearing of your journey and how God has transformed you and how he continues to transform you in other areas of your life. And I would encourage anybody who's listening, you've seen 2 people, one person who started with weight, Stacey, and then me, who started with annoyance. So it's like, you don't have to start with weight, especially if you're an emotional eater. I had about, I've said this on other podcasts, for about 5 pounds of annoyance in me. So there was a certain amount of weight I lost and kept off when I worked through that. So anyway, it's been great having you on the podcast again, Stacey.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're as blessed by that interview as Stacey as I was. And one of the things that Stacey talked about in her interview was renewing the mind and how much God used that to change her. Well, I've talked for quite a while now about doing an online course. And when I did a survey of all of you, how to renew your mind was the top topic. Because of moving, I was not able to finish a course and get an on-demand course up and running, but I am going to do a live course, and I have not worked out all the details of that yet, but that'll be starting in January, I think maybe the 3rd week or so. Anyway, you can find out details about that. Go to barbrobling.com course, COURSE, barbrobling.com course, and you can find out information on that. I hope it's helpful. Okay, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the month, following God and following your boundaries. I'll talk to you next time.